Where were we?
Hello, Janet, and welcome. So today we are going to be talking about some of the screen prints that we're showing as part of the Way We Were exhibition at Orso Major. And this is a series of prints from the 80s and 90s documenting the East London landscape. So tell me, what drew you to the East End?
Well, I was drawn to the East End because I got a job. It's somewhere I'd never imagined going to, and obviously, being a provincial, I had an idea of moving to London, moving to a nice little pad in Chelsea, where in actual fact I ended up in a squat in Whitechapel.
Nice.
I was working in East Ham at the time, in college there. And I was already a printmaker, but the kind of work I was doing was kind of romantic landscapes.
What does that mean, like pastoral scenes or?
Yes, romanticised view of landscape, so they weren't real landscapes. And that didn't seem to resonate much with where I was living, which
Right,
in
of course.
the East End was a very nitty-gritty area at that time. And I acquired my first camera around that time, my first decent camera. And I just started photographing the local area where I lived.
So when would that be? So is that the early 80s? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in particular, I started by photographing lots of the little local corner shops, markets, old pubs. It was at a time when local shops were very individualised. They hadn't become homogenised in a way that they are now.
Right. So is that even along like stretches of what would have been little high streets? Even there were like lots of independents.
I started off just the shops that I actually used because
nice.
And those were the first prints I did actually, were some of the shops that I was actually using locally. But I quickly sort of got very much into just recording all this stuff. So I used to just wander off with my camera, just photographing whatever, starting off with these shops, but then moving on to photographing bits of walls, old signs, and a lot of these areas are very sort of decayed and derelict at the time, so I got quite into the sort of textural quality of that sort of dereliction as well.
Oh, the paint and everything, and the build-up of layers that we see on a lot of these prints actually as well.
Yeah, and I started off screen printing, which was my first love really in printmaking world. I fell in love with it when I made my first print as a student. And the early prints, I suppose I had been looking at a lot of pop art prints. It was an era when screen printing was still it was still quite a new medium actually, and quite of the moment.
Okay.
Whereas now it's been sort of superseded by G-clay prints, digital printing.
So now screen printing certainly is one of those much more process-led things. So was that more a typical kind of way of printing?
Yes, and it was sort of, so kind of a sort of cutting-edge sort of kind of print, I would say, at the time. And I suppose I was trying to push it in one way. I was looking, the early prints are, in a way, sort of hyper-realist. I wanted to capture what was there, all the little bits in the shop windows and the bits of signs, and I used lots of layers of colour, so I was very complex prints really.
So that one particularly, if we're looking at Cafe, has all those elements, doesn't it? The pop art references with the bright colour, then the layers of the window and the planes behind it, but even reference to things of popular culture actually, like the Space Invaders, as you said.
Yes, that one in particular, because it's you can almost date that print just by looking at it, because there are sort of those cultural references there. There's Space Invaders machine. There's a Route Master bus reflected in the window. yeah. So it was all that sort of mixture of pop art, really, references, and using the medium.
And which of the other pieces were produced around the same time as Cafe?
So there was Cafe, there was the Dive, which is a pub, which even then you couldn't really tell what it was called because its sign had been so worn away. I think it was actually called the Crystal Tavern. But
and was it actually in operation when you?
It was just and generally known as the Dive, I think. And internally, very interesting. It was sort of an era left behind. It was all mirrors and gilt and red plush and barmaids sort of getting on in years, but with very big bouffant back-combed hairstyles. I don't think that pub lasted very long after I recorded it. It's gone now. It turned into flats quite early days.
So this one is all screen print, is it?
Yes, it's all screen prints, a mixture of a lot of hand-cut stencils and some photographically produced stencils and lots of layers of transparent colour.
And did the subject matter of the shop fronts and all that happen separate to where you're documenting, say, the street furniture? Or was that all part of just the same project?
It evolved, actually, really. So I started looking at sort of shop fronts, but then just moved up to general views of what was there. So, yeah, it might be a bit of street furniture, it might be a bit of old broken down wall, tower blocks, even, when they started building, in the Docklands. When I first started doing the prints, they hadn't built up Canary Wharf at all, that area. So I recorded that as well. So it was just everything that was happening at the time, everything that was there.
And yet it all seems familiar. It doesn't seem exclusively East London either, when you look at some of these pictures, certainly like the shop fronts. Or even like a picture like Take a Seat. That could be, pretty much any urban place across the UK. Yeah,
it's got a universal quality, although they're all a particular place. I think they do have a sort of universality about them, like you can that bench, in actual fact, that wall is still there, looking exactly the same. I've been past it recently. The benches have been updated a bit to metal ones.
That they can hose down,
yes,
probably.
I always wondered who would want to sit on those benches because they faced the main Mile End Road, which isn't really a very relaxing place to sit.
I think it's a meeting point for people.
Yeah, and the fact that it actually had a can of Tennant's extra sitting there next to it, just
ties it all together, doesn't it? I think that's the fuel of avant-garde poets, isn't it? Tennant's super. And what about then from screen prints? How did that evolve into the much more textured work?
Well, those early prints, I was sort of experimenting with, where screen printing could go. But then I felt that the subject matter, some of it was very sort of textured and worn and faded. So I started experimenting with different ways of portraying that by overlaying, first of all, monoprinting colour down in washes of colour, really, almost like putting watercolour washes down, and then screen printing on tops, to give the whole thing a sort of more painterly look, actually.
And how consistent a result can you get out of that? Because monoprinting is very much about the uniqueness that of the result, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it means that although these are editions, they're very small editions, most of them. Each one is an individual piece, so they can vary quite a bit.
And that's one of the things about printing, isn't it? I mean, I often have to explain to people that it's a print, but it's not absolutely identical to the next one, because the craft and the tradition of printmaking is about the artist's hand on each one.
Yeah,
in many
exactly.
ways, isn't it?
Yeah, so that each one is an original, really. There isn't one original and then it's reproduced. So each piece is an original piece.
I think do you think there's a bit of a confusion with that, or in the way people interpret print now, with giclée being so
Yes,
popular?
It's a pity that they've got the same name, really. Or some people use the same name, print, when it's different processes.
Yeah. So let's look at some of the prints one by one, and let's start with Changing Times. So this one with the nice radio and TV signage.
Well, Changing Times. This was came from a photograph I took in, I guess it was about 1986. It was one of the streets of Brick Lane. I think it possibly Hanbury Street. At the time, the whole street was boarded up shops that had once been there, and the area was waiting to be developed. And I took photographs of several of them. This one really attracted me. Well, radio and TV, it was at a sort of point where things were sort of changing. So radio and TV were sort of resonated a bit with an earlier day, and also the fact you can see behind that some of the sign that went before that. Before it was the radio and TV shops, some of the original sign
that's just been painted over or sort of scraped off as much as they could, and
so it's sort of, in a way, is a good example of the fact that my work is sort of echoes the process that I use, which is printmaking, where I overlay lots of transparent layers of colour printed on top of each other, and it's echoing the subject matter, which as in all cities actually, is where the city develops by each generation adding something to the next generation, and this one is a sort of really good example.
And actually done in a very physical way, isn't it? Like with all the bill postings and the paint sort of just painted on top. So the next print we're going to look at is Shop Local, and this one is also known as Bangladesh Stores because that's what it says on there in big letters. Let's talk about this one. Where was this one? Where is this? Is it around anymore?
Well, this shop was in a little street off Commercial Road in Whitechapel called Hessel Street.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, it was all Bangladesh shops, and this was one of them, painted in those really bright colours, this bright green, turquoise, red, almost as if somebody had sort of got a job lot of paint they'd found.
Yeah.
And they'd replaced the original Jewish shops that were there. And very soon after that, most of that street got redeveloped into a very anonymous red brick development that wasn't even shops.
Ah.
This one, unusually, is still a shop, actually, although I think it's more a wholesale shop than a retail shop now.
Okay.
But I have checked it out, and it is still a shop. But at the time, it just sort of encapsulates wonderful shops that sell everything. You felt, looking in that window, you could go in and anything that you needed, you could probably find in there. And it's called Shop Local because that's what it says in the window or on the door somewhere.
Really
and
small.
I thought, yeah.
And I really like this bright red that pops as well on the left here, of these bubble gum machines or whatever they were, weren't they?
I don't know whether they still... Yeah, they do still have them sometimes, don't they, those bubble gum machines, do they?
I guess.
Yeah. And again, it's that feeling, a splash of very bright colour in there, often bright red, which I really like. So.
And then this one, is this all a screen print? Because as I look at it, I can sort of see the reflection as it would be in the window of.
Yes, it is all a screen print. So
it's
it's lots of layers of screen printing, building that up, up from the building up the reflections and then the external quality of the shop.
Brilliant. And which were the other ones around that same time? Or because I think you said you did a few that were along the same street.
Yes, I did a series of lino cuts. I did one called Lovely Cloth Store.
Oh yeah.
And one that was a very basic butcher's shop. It didn't even have a name, but it was number 40 Hazel Street, which had some serious meat hanging in its window.
Brilliant. So yeah, certainly documenting lots of independent shops around there at that time. But I think, as we said before, some of these things they have a universal appeal as well, don't they? Lots of small high streets up and down the country would have had these sort of solo businesses.
Yeah, and actually not just in this country. Often when you're travelling, you see these little shops that sell everything and anything. Fascinating. I'm always fascinated.
Yeah.
You get a shop window that's got a real mixture of things in there, and you want to go in and see what you could actually buy.
Brilliant. So thank you, Janet, for coming in and talking about all your work. It's brilliant. The exhibition, The Way We Were, runs from the 18th of November to the 29th of November 2014. The works are available to view on the website orsomajor.com under the artist Janet Brooke. Anything else you'd like to add, Janet?
Not really. It'll be interesting to see these works all exhibited together because it's the first time for a long time that they've actually been exhibited together. So it's for me a chance to revisit some old friends.
Brilliant. Looking forward to it. Thank you.